In the distant years, in the 1950s, in a mountainous region in the state of California, a true story of a frightening incident was told to the passengers of a moving train. The story began when, one autumn night, a thick fog sat over the mountains and severely limited visibility. The Silent Run train, known as one of the most beautiful and dangerous railway tracks, was moving at a leisurely pace. The passengers were sitting in the carriages and each one was immersed in his own world. The sounds of train wheels on the tracks, sometimes to a terrible sound, would become that night. A young woman named Melvin, with bright eyes and golden hair, was sitting in the corner of the wagon reading a book about local legends. He was moved by the stories in the book and thought about the amazing journey ahead of him. In the middle of the journey, suddenly the train shook violently and all the lights went out. Absolute darkness reigned in the carriages and the horrible screams of some passengers could be heard under the sound of the wind blowing from the open doors. Melvin was very scared of this situation. He tried to look out the window, but the thick fog was so heavy and sticky that he could not see anything. Suddenly, an excited voice was heard from the end of the wagon, the sound of unfamiliar and irregular steps. The passengers sat in silence and their faces changed with fear. Melvin slowly got up and decided to go to the end of the wagon. He felt he had to know what was going on. His hands were cold and sweaty as he walked towards the sound. A few other passengers also moved towards the sound. After a few minutes, they reached the end of the wagon and saw a window that opened to the outside. Suddenly, a white and soulless figure appeared. The face belonged to a man dressed in old clothes and clearly had a frightened expression. He stared at the passengers and said softly, "Help. I'm stuck here." The fear on his face caused Melvin and the others to take a step back. The man was walking towards them while holding the wall of the wagon with both hands. In the meantime, the train shook violently again, and this time there were strange sounds that was heard outside. Melvin realized that something was moving in the clouds and fog and he couldn't see it. Suddenly, the lights came back on and Melvin looked around with trembling hands. But the old man had disappeared. While the other passengers were crying and panicking, he decided to stand still and think about the incident. After a few minutes, the train suddenly stopped and the train officials announced that they would soon reach the next station. But no one could escape the fear of that night. The story of a strange man who was lost in the fog and the sound of his moans was still echoing in Melvin's ears. It stayed with him for the rest of his life. This frightening incident not only affected Melvin's life, but was remembered as one of the local legends of the area. Yes, sometimes, fog not only harms our vision, but it can also enter into another world. Melvin was never able to return to his normal life after that scary night. He felt that the mysterious man remained in his mind and would never forget him. He began researching the history of the Silent Run Railroad and its strange occurrences which had occurred in it. He did. Melvin gradually realized that many travelers and researchers had talked about the presence of wandering creatures and spirits in this area. One day in a local library, Melvin came across a book about the history of the railroad. It was mentioned in this book that during the Second World War, a military train derailed on this route and all its passengers lost their lives. According to legend, the spirits of those soldiers still roam the area and show themselves to travelers at certain times of the year. Melvin's mind was full of questions and he felt a strange fear in him. Was the man he had seen in the foggy night one of those soldiers? With increased curiosity, Melvin decided to travel to the area where the accident happened. He made an appointment with his friends to go on the weekend on the same train route that he had traveled that day. On Friday, they arrived at the train station and, as predicted, were to spend the night there. The night they spent there, thick fog once again covered the area and the sound of train wheels could be heard in the distance. Melvin and his friends were sitting by the rail and talking about different stories. Suddenly, one of his friends called out his name and said, "Melvin. Luke Doig." He pointed in the far distance and Melvin looked at him worriedly. There, in the mist, a spectacular and unusual figure appeared. This figure was slowly approaching them. Melvin's heart was beating faster and he decided to walk away. But his curiosity and determination were stronger than his fear. The figure moved closer and Melvin realized that it was the same man he had seen on the train. He looked at Melvin with a cold smile and said, "Why are you running away?" "I don't want to hurt you." Melvin was surprised. He didn't know what to do. He said softly, "What do you want?" "I just want our story to be heard," the man replied. "We are forgotten." Melvin sensed that there was a strange longing in the man's voice. He decided to stay and listen. But the rest of his friends ran away under the influence of fear and left him alone. Melvin stood in front of the man and began to listen to the story he was told of life, death, and the battles left over from that time. The man continued his story, "We suffered more during the war than you can imagine. This place is a reminder of pain and our sorrows. I wanted people to know that we also existed and were human. My hope was that one day our story would live on." Melvin's eyes filled with tears. He thought to himself how cruel the world is and how it can create a great distance between humans and spirits. At that moment, he understood that this spirit wanted to return to memories and never be forgotten. The man slowly disappeared into the mist and Melvin felt that he was holding a piece of history in his heart. After that night, Melvin returned home and wrote an account of his experiences. He told this story he'd published in a personal blog and mentioned the memory of the soldiers who were forgotten. The story quickly spread among the people and many people traveled to remember and honor the wandering souls in the area. Melvin realized that when people remember each other, no one is ever forgotten. Today, the story of Melvin and the Silent Runner has become a living legend in the area, with travelers spending nights there every year in memory of the lost soldiers. The fog that night is no longer just a natural phenomenon, but in everyone's mind, the testimony of there are souls who are still searching for peace. In 1891, in the state of Pennsylvania, one of the most mysterious incidents in the history of railroads took place. This story became known as the Forgotten Train and is still debated among researchers and horror legend enthusiasts. The story is a mixture of facts, rumors and possibly fears and wandering spirits. The story begins when the people of a small town in Pennsylvania notice that the local train that usually passes through the station every day has suddenly disappeared. This train is one of the most popular means of transportation in region and its passengers included local workers, students and families. But one day, for unknown reasons, the train stopped passing through the station. The people of the city quickly went to different stations to see if there was any news of the train. But no one had an answer. Rumors began to form that the train was affected by an ancient curse. It was said that in the previous decades, a number of passengers on this train experienced gruesome deaths and their spirits still roamed the train. After a few weeks, a wave of concern was created among the people. Some people claimed to hear the sound of train chains and the mournful cries of passengers at night. Even those who lived near the train tracks experienced frequent bouts of insomnia and some went insane. One night, a group of young people decided to go to the station and continue their investigation. They searched with their flashlights for any sign of the missing train. In the middle of the darkness, suddenly the sound of chains and a loud whistle was heard from far away. The young people looked at each other and fear appeared on their faces. They braved the sound and eventually came to an old, abandoned station that looked like it had been abandoned for years. They opened the station door and went inside. There, they found not only a strange smell that resembled rust and mold, but also a number of old objects and iron strips that appeared to be from an old train. Suddenly, one of the youths shouted that he saw something in the distance. When they all looked towards him, they saw that in the darkness, a subtle light, like a new one, the light of the train is approaching. The young people went towards the light with fear and excitement and suddenly realized that the rail train was coming. They stood carefully and looked towards the train. And to their surprise, they noticed that this train was apparently not filled with any passengers and only its lights were on. At this time, one of them, named Jim, suddenly shouted, "What is this train? And to his amazement he observed that inside the wagons, there were shadows that clearly had the shape of humans. The youth had lost their ability to escape from that situation. The train sped to the abandoned station and its brakes screeched. As the last wagon passed them, they heard horrible whispers. The shadows in the carriages moved closer to each other and made strange noises as if they were fighting inside the carriage. These events caused the shadows to turn towards the youth as if they were seeing them. At one point, one of the youths suddenly felt something heavy sitting on his shoulders and he was being dragged to the ground. He screamed in fear and the rest of the youth were amazed when not finally, the train still disappeared into the thick fog of the night, and the terrified and confused youths left the deserted station alone. They never talked about that night, and no one in town questioned whether or not there really was a train that was running that mysterious night. This story remained as one of the local legends in the region, and since then people avoided approaching the train tracks in the dark of night. They believe that still the wandering souls of those travelers in search of their peace to sleep at night they transform, and from time to time in foggy nights, they will see a light from a forgotten train. In the years since the forgotten train incident, the story has become known as a local legend throughout the Pennsylvania region, along with several independent investigations by paranormal investigators and historians. Many of them tried to discover the source of the legend and the real reasons behind it, but no one could provide conclusive evidence to prove that it happened. In the meantime, a group of researchers found such courage and curiosity in their hearts that they decided to go to the abandoned station on the most special night of the year, Halloween night, and investigate the matter. The group consisted of 6 students from a local university who went there with advanced equipment including thermal imaging cameras and sensitive microphones just to check for any paranormal activity. They arrived at the abandoned station on Halloween night, and after setting up a tea stove, they gathered around and talked about the various stories they had heard from the area. Fear and excitement were evident on their faces. Soon after sunset, they decided to search in the dark. Little by little, the night fell deep and the trees became fragrant. The station produced strange shadows. The members of the group were slowly exploring when suddenly one of them, named Alex, noticed a strange sound in the distance, the sound of chains and a whistle that seemed familiar. "Friends, listen to this whistle." The other members listened to the sound of the train, and to their surprise, they realized that this sound was completely real and close. As the voices reached their ears, lights slowly appeared in the distance. The students moved towards the light with anxiety and curiosity. In the hard darkness, an old and scarred train was approaching. Its lights shone in the cool and muted night, and sad and unintelligible conversations could be heard from inside the carriages. But when they got near the train, suddenly all the lights went out. Panic struck the group and they immediately turned back. But this time, the fear only gradually turned into panic. They felt that the shadows were following them. From behind the bed of darkness and cold, some shadows moved towards them. The members of the group started to shout and ran quickly to get out of there. Alex, scrambling for his cameras at the last moment to record evidence of what they had seen, suddenly noticed the train slowly moving away and disappearing. He ran after his friends, and with every step he took, the sound of chains and moans grew louder in his ears. They finally reached a height and turned on the thermal cameras. As their hands trembled, an image of human figures suspended in wagons appeared on the screen, figures that were clearly trying to scream, but no one heard their voices. Did not arrive hours later, after their panic subsided, the group decided to return to the station and record their experiences. But suddenly, one of the group members, Julie, heard a cold and sad cry from a distance. He quickly realized that the voice was one of the spirits and they were trying to communicate something. Julie and the other members gathered around and calmly asked the spirits to tell their story. To their surprise, they noticed that the shadows were now slowly walking alone, and the moans were slowly diminishing. Absolute silence took its place. At that moment, Julie felt a cold hand on hers, gently pulling her towards the wagons. With this feeling, Julie approached the last carriage and saw pictures of ghosts and passengers on the wall. They were looking at him as if asking for his help. "We're going to tell people your story," Julie told them with a heart full of emotion, lovingly and simply. After that moment, everything calmed down again and peace returned to the abandoned station. The group decided that because of those spirits and the story terrible they are, in a world that may never be seen, to try and resist oblivion. This story is a true story that was passed down from generation to generation. After that night, the group decided to launch a campaign to bring attention and preserve the memory of those ghosts and reveal the true story of the forgotten train. In the late 1980s, in the state of Texas, a scary and true story of a train was born, which is still a reminder of a terrible night for the residents of that area. This story is commonly known as Night Train, and every time it is mentioned in local circles, it creates feedback of anxiety and concern among people. On one rainy night, in a small town called Harlingen, a group of friends decided to go to the local train station for sightseeing. This station, which has been in use for years, has become a hidden place for entertainment, and entertainment fear had become many young local residents told stories and legends about the station and the trains that never arrived. The group of friends consisted of 5 people, including 2 close friends named Jack and Lisa. They had grown up together since their teenage days and were known for exciting adventures. That night, armed with flashlights and cameras, they decided to explore the station and challenge themselves on scary stories. When they reached the station, it was raining heavily and darkness soon cast a shadow over them. Despite their fear and anxiety, they went inside the station together and tried to enjoy its mysterious atmosphere. But from the very beginning, there was a strange feeling in the atmosphere, the sound of the rails swaying in the wind, and sometimes distant sounds similar to the sound of a train whistle could be heard. That is, suddenly, when Jack and Lisa looked at their camera, they started to panic with shame and anxiety. They felt as if someone else was watching them. Mourns and sad cries could be heard from far away. At the same time, it started to rain heavily. It increased and the surrounding trees began to blow. Feeling alarmed, Jack suggested the group return to the bus. But Lisa, ever bold, said, "Why don't we go into the wagon? We might find some interesting stories there." The suggestion made Jack anxious, but he eventually joined the others. They nervously went to one of the wagons and opened the door. Inside the wagon was a narrow and dark space where the smell of dampness and mold could be felt. When they turned on their flashlights, they encountered a strange scene. The walls of Vaggett was covered with horrible and scary pictures and writings. Suddenly, a friend named Sammy saw white spots in a big picture making strange movements. Without thinking, he went towards that negative energy and asked for it. But at the same time, the light of the flashlight suddenly turned off and the space was plunged into absolute darkness. Each member of the group went to a corner and tried to escape from the terror of this darkness. Gradually clearer voices were heard, sounds like moans and screams coming from far away. Jack, with the headache he felt, he decided to get out of the wagon and others followed him. But when they went outside, they found that there was no more rain and no more natural sounds of the night. Everything was strangely quiet. In the silence that had arisen, only the sound of the frightened breaths of friends could be heard. They started walking towards the station, but in the middle of the night, they heard a strange whistling sound once again. This time the sound was right next to them and it sounded like an approaching train. Anxiety and fear reached its peak. Shouted a friend named Michael, "Go! Leave here!" But as soon as they tried to escape, suddenly a ghostly train came towards them. There were no lights or sounds, but his movement was clearly visible. Jack and the others paddled towards the exit and disappeared into the darkness without knowing how. As they turned back to the road, the sounds of wails and terror still echoed in their minds. They were very scared and still could not come to terms with what had happened. According to the friends, none of them had been able to sleep at home. In the following days, some of them felt that the shadows of that night are still around them. Jack and Lisa were particularly affected by the incident, hearing the train whistle every time it rained, as if the song of darkness still haunted them. The story of the night train became a local legend among the people of Harlingen, and every year on special occasions, people would gather together to remember that scary night and talk about the story of those young people. Some still believed that the train was searching for the souls of the missing passengers, and those who had returned to the station were still searching peace and freedom live in that darkness of uncertainty. This horror story not only brings back the memories of a terrible night, but also reminds us that we cannot control some events, and in the heart of darkness, facts may mix with legends.